My boss fired me over a rumor that didn't even exist. No warning. No proof. Just a 5-minute conversation that ended 17 years of my life. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I just nodded once and said, I understand. 3 weeks later, the company collapsed. My name's Ryan Cole, 48 years old. Senior systems analyst at Brookfield Dynamics, or at least I was. Until that Monday morning when everything I'd built was ripped away in less time than it takes to pour a cup of coffee. It started with an email, meeting with HR, 10 a.m. No subject, no explanation. I thought it was about the security audit I'd submitted last week. Turns out, the audit was exactly why they wanted me gone. When I walked into the conference room, my manager, Alex Jennings, was already sitting there with the HR director. 2 cups of coffee on the table. Only one was steaming. The air was stiff, like the oxygen had been sucked out before I arrived. Ryan, Alex said, not even meeting my eyes. A concern's been raised regarding your conduct. We've received reports that you've been leaking sensitive information to outside vendors. I didn't move, didn't blink. I just looked at him, waiting for the part where he'd say it was a misunderstanding. He never did. That's not true, I said quietly. Regardless, the HR director cut in. Corporates decided to terminate your employment effective immediately. You'll receive 2 weeks of severance and a standard reference letter. 17 years reduced to a script someone else had written. I could have shouted. I could have begged. Instead, I stood, buttoned my jacket, and said, I understand. Then I left. Walking out of that building felt like watching my own funeral. The looks from coworkers, half pity, half fear. The security guard avoiding my eyes as he took my badge. The sound of the glass doors closing behind me. Final. The rumor, whatever it was, had spread fast. I could see it in the way people whispered in the lobby as I passed. But here's what they didn't know. I'd already seen something weeks earlier, something that made this whole thing make sense. There were hidden financial transfers buried deep in the system logs, names that didn't match any registered vendors, and approval signatures that looked wrong. I'd flagged it quietly, reported it through the proper channel. The next day, my access started disappearing piece by piece. By the time they called me into HR, I knew it was coming. I just didn't know how fast they'd move. That afternoon, I drove home, sat in my car, and replayed every word Alex said. Reports of leaking information. That phrase wasn't random. Someone had planted it. Someone who needed me gone before I connected the last dots. They thought I'd walk away quietly. But that was their mistake. Because silence isn't surrender. It's strategy. And I was just getting started. I didn't leave town right away. I stayed quiet, kept my head down, and started watching. When you've worked somewhere for nearly 2 decades, you learn the rhythms, the coffee breaks, the late-night emails, the little mistakes that reveal who's panicking. I could smell it. Someone inside Brookfield was scrambling. The first night after I was fired, I barely slept. I sat in my home office staring at the folder I'd labeled integrity logs. It wasn't much, just system access records, timestamps, and fragments of data I'd pulled during my last week. But to the right eyes, it would be enough to prove something was wrong. Alex Jennings, my manager, wasn't smart enough to engineer this alone. He was a company man, obedient, cautious, easily manipulated. But someone above him had orchestrated it. The rumor about me leaking information had been a cover, a diversion to hide something much bigger. 2 days later, I got an unexpected call. Not from HR. From a blocked number. The voice on the other end was low, nervous. Ryan, this is Sam from accounting. We shouldn't be talking, but you didn't deserve what happened. Be careful who you trust. They're cleaning up files. Digital shred. I think your report triggered something. Then he hung up. Cleaning up files. That confirmed it. Whatever I'd found in those access logs was real, and now they were trying to bury it. I opened my laptop, loaded the encrypted backup drive I'd made before everything went south. My copies were clean, untouched. But something new caught my attention. There were outbound data packets leaving the company's servers days before my termination. Unscheduled. Encrypted but traceable. I ran the addresses through a tracking program I'd written years ago. The trail led to a consulting firm in Chicago. The name was familiar, Everline Partners. I remembered seeing it on invoices, small ones, always approved by Alex. Everline wasn't a real vendor. It was a shell. Payments were being routed through it every quarter, disguised as software optimization fees. But the amounts didn't match any project I'd managed. Someone was siphoning money through fake contracts, and I'd stumbled onto their pipeline. I printed everything. I didn't trust digital storage anymore. Paper can't vanish with one keystroke. That night, I took a walk past the company building. From across the parking lot, I saw Alex leaving with a briefcase he never carried before. He looked over his shoulder twice before unlocking his car. Guilt has a body language. He wore it like a second skin. I didn't approach him. Not yet. I wasn't ready to confront anyone until I had every piece. When people destroy your reputation, they expect you to fight back emotionally, to shout, to post online, to beg for sympathy. I wasn't giving them that satisfaction. I was going to dismantle their lies the same way I'd built systems for years, quietly, line by line, until the whole structure exposed itself. The rumor that got me fired was their weapon. But silence was going to be mine. 3 days after that call from Sam, I stopped being an ex-employee and became something else, an investigator with nothing to lose. I knew Brookfield dynamics inside out. I knew the blind spots in their security system, the audit trails no one checked, and the one loophole they could never close: me. Every terminated account leaves digital residue. It's impossible to erase completely. Using an old VPN key I'd built for system testing years ago, I slipped back into their internal network. Not to damage anything, just to watch. Observation is power when your enemy thinks you're gone. The company's activity logs looked clean on the surface, but deep in the data stream were anomalies. Files moved at odd hours, permissions reassigned to temporary users that didn't exist a week earlier. Each phantom profile traced back to a single source: the CFO, Robert Lanning. He'd been there almost as long as I had. Polished, respected, untouchable. Lanning had always played politics better than anyone. The kind of man who smiled in your face and signed your termination papers an hour later. If he was tied to Everline Partners, then this wasn't a simple accounting error. It was fraud, high-level, deliberate, and surgical. That night, I drove past Lanning's office building downtown. His car was still in the lot after midnight. The lights on the 7th floor burned through the blinds. I sat there in the dark, engine off, watching. He wasn't working late. He was covering tracks. Back home, I compiled everything I had: timestamps, transfer records, IP logs. I needed verification before making a move. One mistake, one wrong assumption, and I'd look like the bitter ex-employee they already painted me as. I needed someone credible, someone still inside. So I reached out to Sam again. I used a prepaid phone and a single text: need proof. Meet me off-site. He replied with one word: tomorrow. We met in the back booth of an empty diner near the highway. He looked exhausted, like someone who hadn't slept in days. He slid a flash drive across the table. Said he'd copied backup transaction records before the purge began. They're blaming you for the leak, he told me quietly. But the real leak came from Lanning's office. Then he left without finishing his coffee. Back home, I opened the files. The truth was worse than I expected. The company had been funneling money through Everline Partners into another entity, a private holding account under a name I recognized: Alex Jennings, my former boss. That was the moment the puzzle snapped into place. Alex had sold me out to protect Lanning. They needed a scapegoat for the irregularities, someone believable. I was perfect: long tenure, access to systems, no history of confrontation. They thought firing me would end it. But what they didn't understand was that I don't stop at revenge. I build systems that don't break. And this time, I was designing one just for them. I spent the next 48 hours turning that flash drive into a weapon. Not the kind that destroys, it exposes. Every file Sam gave me connected to a web of payments, invoices, and falsified vendor contracts. The deeper I dug, the clearer it became. Brookfield Dynamics wasn't just hiding a few bad transactions. They were laundering millions through fake accounts, and I had stumbled into the middle of it. Alex Jennings and Robert Lanning were at the center, but they weren't alone. There were sign-offs from 2 other executives, both board members. Each one had quietly approved software modernization fees, routed through Everline Partners. It wasn't a partnership, it was a pipeline. I needed to make my next move count. I couldn't take it to the media yet. That would look like revenge. I couldn't go to HR. They'd been complicit from the start. The only way to dismantle a system like this was from the inside, using their own rules against them. That's when I remembered the audit trail protocol I had built years ago. It logged every financial access across the company network, including administrative overrides. They'd kept it running after I left, unaware that I had created a hidden copy, a backup sync to an external mirror. I checked the archive. It was still active. The last entries showed that someone was accessing the internal ledgers daily from Lanning's terminal, deleting historical data in batches. They were trying to erase evidence faster than I could gather it. So I flipped the script. I began restoring fragments from the mirrored copy and cross-linking them with their new edits. Every deletion they made became another breadcrumb leading straight to them. Within days, I had a chronological record of their cover-up. But I needed more than data. I needed proof of intent. Numbers could be explained away, but intent couldn't. I knew Lanning well enough to predict his habits. Every Friday night, he stayed late to finalize reports before the weekend. That's when he moved money. I called Sam again, told him to keep quiet and monitor the accounting queue. "You'll see a transfer," I said. "Flag the timestamp and don't touch anything." That Friday, right at 8:47 p.m., it happened. A transfer of $680,000 left the company's liquidity account and vanished into Everline Partners. What they didn't realize was that my mirrored system recorded not just transactions, but the device fingerprints of whoever approved them. And this time, it wasn't Alex or Lanning. It was someone higher, the CEO herself. That was the moment I understood. I hadn't been fired because of a rumor. I'd been erased to protect an empire. When I saw her name attached to that transaction, I froze. Laura Benton, Chief Executive Officer. The public face of Brookfield Dynamics. Sharp, polished, the kind of leader who spoke in headlines and handshakes. She wasn't supposed to be part of this. But the data didn't lie. Her login credentials had approved the $680,000 transfer, verified by a biometric signature. Either she was directly involved, or someone had access to her account. And that kind of access didn't happen by accident. That night, I sat alone in my kitchen, the glow from the laptop reflecting off my coffee cup. I'd seen corruption before, but not at this level. If Laura was in on it, then the entire company was rotten from the top down. I didn't sleep. I spent the night mapping connections. Alex, Lanning, the board members, and now Laura. Every name connected through Everline Partners. Every payment justified by fake contracts I could trace back to one source document. A software renewal agreement that didn't exist. By morning, I had a blueprint of the fraud, but I needed leverage before I went public. Without it, they'd crush me, frame me, and finish what they started. So I set a trap. On Monday, I sent Laura a polite email from a new account. Anonymous, encrypted, and untraceable. I told her I had information about a potential internal data breach and offered to share my findings discreetly. Within 2 hours, she replied through her assistant, requesting a meeting. Virtual, off the record. At exactly 3 p.m., the call connected. Her image appeared on my screen. Calm, composed, confident. She didn't recognize my voice right away when I spoke, and for a second, I saw something flicker behind her eyes when she realized who I was. "I'm not looking for money," I told her. "I'm looking for the truth." She smiled like a CEO trained to handle crisis. She said she didn't know what I was talking about, that everything had been investigated already. Her tone was steady, but her eyes betrayed her. Every denial tightened the noose. While she talked, I ran a trace on the connection. The call wasn't coming from corporate headquarters. It was routed through the same Chicago server used by Everline Partners. That was my proof. She wasn't just complicit, she was running the operation herself. When the call ended, I didn't celebrate. I backed up the recording, stored it offline, and labeled it insurance. If I was going to bring down Brookfield Dynamics, it wouldn't be loud. It would be silent, precise, and irreversible. And the countdown had already started. After that call, I knew I couldn't stop. Not until every piece was exposed. But timing mattered more than evidence. If I moved too soon, they'd spin it as corporate sabotage. If I waited too long, they'd erase everything and vanish. I had to strike when they felt safest. So I went quiet. For 2 weeks, I disappeared completely. No digital trace, no emails, no movement that could be tracked. I wanted Laura and her team to think they'd won, that I was broken, irrelevant. People like that get careless when they believe the threat is gone. And they did. The system logs from my hidden mirror showed increased activity across the finance network. Massive data migrations, account closures, a quiet reshuffling of internal control systems. They were preparing an exit, an organized dismantling before the board or auditors noticed. But I had something they didn't: their schedule. I knew Laura was planning to announce a strategic merger with a European firm next month. The perfect cover to launder the rest of the stolen money and bury the old company in the process. I couldn't stop the merger directly, but I could control the story. So I began creating my own trail, one that pointed exactly where I wanted it to. I built a series of anonymous reports, each containing fragments of real financial data linked to Everline partners. Enough to look legitimate, but vague enough to avoid direct exposure. I leaked them to 3 different journalists under the same alias, someone inside Brookfield's finance division. Within days, whispers started spreading across business forums and shareholder channels. People began asking questions. Who was Everline Partners? Why did their invoices double in the last quarter? And why was every transaction approved by the CEO? Inside Brookfield, panic set in. The HR director emailed employees, warning them not to speak to the press. Lanning issued a company-wide statement about false narratives and malicious rumors. The irony wasn't lost on me. The same language they'd used to destroy me was now eating them alive. Meanwhile, Sam kept feeding me updates. He said Lanning was holding late-night meetings in the executive wing, shredding documents, demanding loyalty oaths. Laura stopped showing up in person. She was operating remotely, probably from Chicago. They didn't know it yet, but the fuse had already been lit. The journalists had reached out to the SEC for verification, and when that agency starts looking, they don't stop until they find fire under the smoke. I didn't need to lift another finger. All I had to do was wait. And waiting was something I perfected a long time ago. 2 weeks after the leaks hit the press, the first cracks began to show. Brookfield Dynamics stock dropped 9% overnight. The official line was speculative volatility, but insiders knew better. Something was rotting behind closed doors, and the smell was spreading fast. Sam told me that auditors had arrived unannounced, demanding access to records. Lanning tried to stall, claiming they needed clearance from legal. But the auditors weren't corporate, they were federal. That meant someone, somewhere, had handed over evidence strong enough to trigger a government probe. I stayed silent, monitoring everything through the mirrored system. Each new update was another domino falling exactly as planned. Laura's schedule became erratic. Missed calls, canceled meetings, sudden travel to Europe. It was the kind of chaos that comes when powerful people realize control has slipped away. Still, I knew she'd try one last move. Cornered leaders always do. And it came sooner than I expected. Late one night, I got a message on an encrypted channel I hadn't used in years. It was from an unknown contact, but the phrasing was familiar. You started something you can't contain. Let's talk before it ends badly, for both of us. No name, no signature, but I recognized her tone. It was Laura. She wanted to negotiate. The next morning, I met her at a small cafe downtown. She was dressed like a civilian, no bodyguards, no entourage, just a black coat and sunglasses that didn't quite hide the exhaustion in her eyes. She spoke first, her voice low but sharp. She said the leaks were dangerous, that I'd misunderstood everything, that the transfers were legal. I let her talk. Then I slid a small flash drive across the table. On it was the recording of our last call, the one routed through the Everline server. I told her she should listen to her own lies before rehearsing new ones. She didn't touch it. She just sat there, frozen. I told her I wasn't after money or revenge. I wanted truth, accountability, and silence, the kind that ends careers, not lives. She asked what I planned to do. I told her the decision wasn't mine anymore. The system had already begun correcting itself. When I stood to leave, she finally spoke, almost whispering. She said, "You think this will destroy me?" I paused at the door. "No," I said. "You already did that yourself." That was the last time I saw her. By the following week, federal agents were walking through Brookfield's headquarters, and the countdown I'd started was almost over. The morning the agents arrived, Brookfield's headquarters looked like a siege zone. Black sedans lined the street, and men in suits walked through the glass doors with briefcases and federal badges. Employees huddled in small clusters outside, whispering, texting, trying to piece together what was happening. I watched it unfold from my apartment 2 blocks away. The local news caught wind of it within the hour. Federal investigation underway at Brookfield Dynamics. They didn't know yet what the charges were, but they didn't have to. The speculation alone was enough to finish what I'd started. Sam called me that afternoon, his voice shaking. He said Lanning had been escorted out by security, his office sealed, his computer seized. Alex Jennings resigned on the spot, claiming health issues. HR sent out a company-wide message about temporary restructuring. Everyone knew it was over. By sunset, the story was everywhere: fraud, embezzlement, executive corruption. The amount shocked even me. Nearly $40 million funneled through Everline Partners and offshore accounts tied to shell companies. The CEO, the CFO, and 2 board members were officially under investigation for financial misconduct and wire fraud. I didn't celebrate. I didn't feel triumph or vengeance. What I felt was a kind of stillness, the kind that comes after a long storm finally stops. That night, I drove past the building one last time. The lights were off except for the faint glow from the security floor. I parked across the street and sat there, remembering the day I'd been fired. The same lobby, the same glass doors. Back then, I walked out carrying a cardboard box, convinced my career was over. Now, the people who had destroyed me were gone, their empire collapsing under the weight of its own lies. The next day, the SEC contacted me. They said they'd received several anonymous reports that matched information in their investigation. They wanted to confirm the origin. I told them I couldn't help, that I'd simply read the same articles as everyone else. The agent paused, then said, "Whoever did this knew exactly where to hit them. Whoever it was, they were precise." I didn't answer, just thanked him and hung up. 3 weeks after my firing, Brookfield Dynamics officially declared bankruptcy. The merger deal dissolved, investors fled, and the company's assets were frozen pending investigation. From the outside, it looked like bad luck. But I knew better. It wasn't luck. It was engineering. Quiet, deliberate, and final. When the company went under, it didn't make me rich. It didn't erase the months of anxiety or sleepless nights. What it gave me was something cleaner: closure. The kind that doesn't come from applause or revenge, but from knowing the truth finally surfaced, no matter how deep they tried to bury it. The media called it the quiet collapse. A company that had once been a symbol of innovation imploding from within. Analysts blamed internal mismanagement, but the real story never made it to headlines. They never mentioned the one employee who saw the cracks before anyone else. I preferred it that way. I didn't need credit. I'd already gotten what I wanted: the silence of people who used to think they could speak over me. Sam found another job a few weeks later. He sent me a message saying the investigators had cleared him, that he'd been listed as a cooperating witness. He thanked me, though I never told him how deep his help had gone. He deserved peace, not the burden of knowing how close he'd come to the edge. Alex Jennings vanished from the city. Rumor was he'd fled to Arizona, trying to start over under a new name. Lanning faced charges, and Laura Benton, she was the last one to fall. When the evidence finally reached federal court, her lawyers tried everything: denial, misdirection, shifting blame. But the paper trail was too precise, too thorough. Every forgery, every signature, every hidden transaction led back to her. I read about her sentencing 6 months later. 5 years. That was it. 5 years for destroying lives, stealing millions, and building an empire on lies. Justice doesn't always come balanced, but it comes. I moved out of the city soon after. Found a quiet place on the coast. Small town, small house, enough space to breathe. I work freelance now, security consulting for small businesses. The irony isn't lost on me. The same systems that ruined me are the ones I protect others from. Sometimes I still get emails from old colleagues, people who finally learned the truth. They ask how I knew, how I managed to survive it all. I never answer. Some stories aren't meant to be told. What happened at Brookfield Dynamics wasn't just a scandal. It was a system failure, not of software, but of people, and I made sure it could never reboot again. It took almost a year before I stopped waking up expecting an email from HR or a knock on my door. When you spend that long being watched, investigated, and doubted, silence feels unnatural at first. But over time, it becomes a kind of peace. I didn't keep souvenirs from Brookfield Dynamics. Not the old ID badge, not the framed award from my 10-year anniversary. I deleted every file, burned every hard drive. The past didn't need to be stored. It needed to stay buried. But there was one thing I kept, the small notebook I'd carried during the final weeks before I was fired. Inside it, 3 words I'd written the day everything began: freeze, track, respond. It wasn't a plan. It was survival. And somehow, it had become the blueprint for dismantling an empire. Sometimes I think about that meeting in HR, about Alex sitting there pretending it wasn't his decision. The way he wouldn't look me in the eye. I wonder if he ever realized that the quiet man walking out of that office was already building the system that would undo them all. Probably not. People like Alex never see the threat coming until it's too late. One afternoon, I drove back to the city. Just for closure. The old Brookfield building was empty now, the logo stripped from the glass, the lobby dark. A construction sign read, "Property under redevelopment." The empire was being rebuilt, different name, same walls. I stood across the street and thought about how easily power changes hands, how corruption just puts on a new suit. Then I smiled, because I knew those walls carried a ghost. Mine. Before I left, I slipped a small note through the cracked front door. 4 words, handwritten in ink. Systems remember everything. R.C. I never went back. These days, I keep my world small. No boardrooms, no deadlines, no suits. Just the ocean, the hum of a computer fan, and the satisfaction of quiet work done right. People think revenge is loud, dramatic, explosive. They're wrong. Real revenge is quiet. It's surgical. It's watching the ones who buried you dig their own graves while you rebuild your life in peace. I didn't destroy Brookfield Dynamics out of anger. I dismantled it out of necessity. They taught me one lesson I'll never forget. Never underestimate the power of silence. Because some men fight back loud, and some build systems that speak for them. Real men don't explode. They exit. Subscribe for more power stories.